fellow and lecturer at Pembroke College, and she has a wide, obviously a wide depth of knowledge and expertise from 1700 onwards, particularly interested in literature and the humanities. And a book is coming out next year. You've edited it with a doctoral and lots of other things. Look on the website. So she's going to talk about Dickens' style, and I'm sure we're going to all enjoy it hugely. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can I check that my mic is working? I'm sure it is, actually. Is that better?
Yes.
I might have to hold it like that. It's going to be really comfortable, isn't it? We'd have boomed into Kitty and delivery. Yeah, should we try? Better? Is that better? I'll project as well. To go back to old-fashioned projection might help. All right, when people talk about Dickens' style, it's in the main really obvious what we're talking about. We're talking about a kind of theatrical excess, really, at its most basic. A kind of performativity with metaphor, an ability to take really odd metaphors or anthropomorphizations, turning non-human things into human things. Above all, the ability to string out a particular stylistic effect by repetition so far that you just go, wow, it's a kind of rhetorical performance where it's very plain, even if the voice speaking is not Dickens. So for most obviously Pip, for example, in Great Expectations, you can always hear Dickens behind it. It's one of the most recognizable styles in English. It would be very odd in some ways, although I'll say things that will counter this in a minute, to take a page of Dickens and recognize it as, you're not likely to recognize it as any other writer. And I've wondered for a while, actually, looking at the success of this Dickens bicentennial year, whether that recognizability of style is one of the explanations why there should be such a strong desire to memorialize this one writer. I think probably only Shakespeare would carry this degree of attention in a big celebratory year like this. Even Austen, there just isn't the body of work or the stylistic recognizability to carry such a wide public response so many years after his death. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit odd in a way, because I think a description of Dickens's normal style, or what we usually understand by Dickens' style, is probably something you don't need, that you already have enough of from what I've just said and in your heads anyway. I want to press an argument instead that there is, especially in late Dickens, a kind of problem with that recognizability of his own style, and that there might be signs in very late Dickens, and I'll talk especially about the last unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, of an attempt to get beyond the manufacturing and the celebrating and the marketing of his own style. So a kind of frustration building up in him that style has been so successful that it's hugely widely imitated, it's marketized, and it's leaving him kind of pinioned in that sort of performance repetition, something that he would, for obvious reasons, any writer would like also to break free of. Now, from the very first moments in his career, so from the reception of Pickwick onwards, Dickens has a real problem with imitators. He talks in 1840 about his desire to baffle the imitators being a very deep thing with him, and to make his work as novel as possible. So the moment an issue of Master Humphrey's Clock or whatever it is comes out, there's a whole industry of people trying to copy it or trying to adapt the work for the stage and to produce second-hand Dickens in as close an imitation of the real thing as they possibly can. And some of them are pretty good at it. In 1854, he writes to one of his friends to say, well, thank you for the praise for the walk, but it's not mine. He said, it's very well done by a close imitator. There are a lot of ways in which Dickens tried to get hold of this phenomenon and kind of keep it for himself, or keep Dickensian writing as Dickens' own thing. The one that's probably most talked about is copyright law. Some of you will know he was extremely closely involved in developing English copyright law and pressing for international copyright law, so that phenomenon of him publishing something in England and the Americans quickly running off their own copies and making huge profits for publishers, none of it coming back to him, was something that he pretty successfully fought. He also helps to set up the Royal Literary Fund, another of the institutional means by which he tries to make sure that writers are properly paid for their own product and not ripped off in the marketplace. But probably the most important one is the way in which he tried to take possession of that style through his own periodicals. So first Household Words, probably the more famous of the two, and then in the later years All the Year Round. What he's doing there is selling very cheaply every week at, I think it's £2 a week, performances of his own style, and he has a whole band of what is called Dickens's young men writing for him. Now, of course, one of the things they learn to do very early on is to write like Dickens, and that is for many of them both a subject of pride, and it's also a subject of considerable ambivalence, because most of them were also writers in training, even if they were just journalists, not literary writers. And having a style of your own is pretty much indispensable if you're going to be any success at it. So being an imitation Dickens is both a kind of a sign of high praise, you managed to pull it off, but also something one might feel a little bit ambivalent about, as I say. Now, if you look at the things that are said about him after his death by those young men who worked for him, they're full of that ambivalence. This is Percy Fitzgerald, who was one of his protégés, a close friend, talking about him just a few years after he died. Dickens practically trained up quite a new style of writers, insensibly moulding them to his own peculiar pattern and style. Words, he says, were the counters in a form of stylistic play by which they showed their proficiency at copying the master. One of the descriptions of this kind of copy to Dickens in the periodicals was rather like was Dickens and water, kind of watered down Dickens, if you like. Now he's writing, in fact, 40 years after the death of Dickens. If you want to follow it up, it's a book called Memories of Charles Dickens, published in 1913. You can see him both welcoming the idea that he was one of these proficient young Dickensians and trying to tell you at the same time that he is unlike the others, that he actually managed to maintain his own style all the way through. So he describes the others as being only too eager and apt at imitation, even clever enough to pick up a sort of mock Dickensese dialect, a kind of forced smartness with the sustained design of being funny and quite easy to acquire. So it was a perfect knack and quite easy to acquire. And he lists the symptoms. If you want to write copy Dickens, imitation Dickens, this is what you do. Grotesque nicknaming is a good start. Exaggeration as a sustained principle. So anything that can be, heightened, brightened was Dickens's routine directive to his young copiers. Then do it. And flamboyance. But Fitzgerald says, not entirely gratefully, it was all mechanical. This is the first quotation on the sheet if you want to follow it. If you pick up a copy of Household Words 50 years after its stopped publication, he said, it's conscious of a certain flatness as of champagne left long uncorked. The writers were compelled, owing to the necessity of producing effect, to adopt a tone of exaggeration. Everything, even trivial, had to be made more comic than it really was. This was the law of the paper. As I can testify from my own experience, this pressure became all but irresistible. A mere natural, unaffected account of any transaction, it was felt, was out of place. It would not harmonize with the brilliant, buoyant things surrounding it. I often think with some compunction of my own trespassings in this way and of the bad habit one gradually acquired of colouring up for effect and of magnifying the smallest trifle. There's another of these young men called John Hollingshead, another kind of grateful-ungrateful combination, who adds to that taxonomy of signature Dickens what he calls a tricky way with titles. So they're typically punning titles, or they're titles that will raise curiosity in the reader while concealing the subject. For example, A Piece of China, A Curious Dance Around a Curious Tree, which is actually a piece about a lunatic asylum, Where We Stopped Growing, about those psychological moments that arrest us and that we never quite lose from our sense of our own development. Now, one of the nicest examples of this, because so many of these men give one an uncomfortable sense that they are reacting against Dickens after Dickens' death when Dickens can no longer reply. So it's an odd genre within the Dickens memoir. The best of them, I think, are actually the two young men, one in particular, Richard Brough, who were brave enough to do it while Dickens was alive, to take the mickey out of Dickens by showing up these stylistic features and satirising them. And to put it out there where he was able to speak back to them. So this is Richard Brough in a piece called Hard Times Refinished, mocking Dickensian sentimentalism and Dickensian excess. And I'm really sorry you're going to have to get Hard Times dialect via New Zealand, which is not going to be very persuasive, but I'll do my best. I, Stephen, Rachel asks the bruised and battered man retreat from the mine shaft, who's now lying before her with a cloth placed over his head. How dost thou feel? Humble and happy, lass. I be grateful and thankful. I be obliged to them as I've brought charges of robbery again me, and I hope as them as did it will be happy and enjoy the fruits. I do only look on my being pitched down that mere shaft and having all my bones broke as a mercy and a providence, and God bless everybody. Okay. No need to tell you where that one comes from. That takes guts to do that in front of the master, and he does seem to have forgiven them for it. It's anxiety of incident, anxiety of influence, as Harold Bloom famously called it. But it's also doing some critical work, actually. One of the things it tells you is that in addition to hallmark Dickensian sentimentalism, stylistic things one can look out for is the tendency to do very undirected dialogue exchanges, so you just have one voice against the other. So it looks very like a stage play. You can see Dickens's fascination with theatre coming through on the page there. It's very much like reading a play script at times. It's also got the exaggerated dialectical flags, so dialect comes in very strong local forms. It's of course not sustained. It's sort of cluing you into a dialect, but doing so very strongly. The habit of self-reference, so Dickens is very often referring back to his own earlier works, The Christmas Carol in this case, being picked out. It's quite surprising. One of Dickens's best biographers and critics, Philip Collins, notes that he seems to have forgiven them for it. Now, Dickens's nickname, The Inimitable, has become very famous, but the funny thing about it is that it seems to me so clearly wrong. He wasn't inimitable, he was being imitated all the time. Some of them were doing it very successfully. Excuse me, I'm tangled up in my cords here. I want to turn to the question of where that style came from and how far it might make sense to talk about Dickens having a theory of style. And the argument I'm going to start pressing is that when Dickens talks about a theory of style, the odd thing about it is that it runs completely counter to this notion of excess and exaggeration. It goes in quite the opposite direction. Now, what people most often say about where Dickens learned his stylistic tools of trade is that it came through the English comic tradition. So it goes through Shakespeare and Congreve, and then the major English comic novelists. So Roderick Random, Peregrine Pickle, Humphrey Clinker, that list of books that you find in David Copperfield and also in the autobiographical fragment on the shelf. Tom Jones, the Vicar of Wakefield, and some from Europe as well, Don Quixote, Gil Blas, and then of course Robinson Crusoe. That's one genealogy, the comic genealogy, but there's another that isn't really talked about at all. The only person I'm aware of who's pointed to it in any way is Tom Paulin, in a brief essay a few years ago, and that is Hazlitt, the great 18th century stylist. Dickens owned pretty much everything Hazlitt had written. As far as we know, he didn't meet Hazlitt before his death, but he befriended his son. He seems to have acted as a referee for him at some point. And Paulin's interest really is in what he calls a kind of deep imaginative kinship between the two writers. They were both parliamentary shorthand reporters in their youth. They were both trained at observing and adept at parodying people's oratorical styles. So they loved the kind of redundancies and the superfluities of speechifying, as Dickens called it. There was a lot about their tastes and interests that suggests that if they had met, they would have liked each other enormously, and impatience with the established order, a love of inns, long country walks, inner London, the life of the common people, and a fascination with the psychopathology of criminals, which is a theme I'll come back to. Paulin goes so far as to suggest that there may be exact echoes of little bits of Hazlitt's style coming through in one of the novels. I'm not sure about that, but I do think that there is a clear influence of Hazlitt in the matter of how he thought about style. One of Hazlitt's most famous essays is called On Familiar Style. And it talks about the best kind of style being, familiar style, a style that avails itself of the true idiom of the language, writing as one would speak in common conversation, who had a thorough command and choice of words, or who could discourse with ease, force, and perspicuity, setting aside all pedantic and oratorical flourishes. You can see what it's got in common with the comic tradition that he so liked, because Fielding, for example, has exactly this reaction against affectation. Most of the comedy in Tom Jones is about showing up people's affectations. And underneath that, a kind of liking for plain, what both of them would call manly speech, direct, speaking to the common intelligent person. When Dickens writes in his letters to other writers, giving them recommendations on how to improve their writings for his periodicals or just reflections on what they've written and published in their own right, there There are certain words that keep coming back, and they're exactly the same words with a few missing that Hazlitt recommended. Subtlety, not what you might necessarily think of with Dickens. Ease, simplicity, wholesomeness, reality, honesty. And above all, in a more specifically gendered fashion, he praises men of force. Writing without affectation doesn't seem to have been for him about plain John Bull bluntness. Instead, he shares Hazlitt's conviction, and this is at the bottom of your sheet, that it is not easy to write a familiar style. Many people mistake a familiar for a vulgar style and suppose that to write without affectation is to write at random. On the contrary, there is nothing that requires more precision than the style I'm speaking of. It utterly rejects not only all unmeaning pomp, but all low, cant phrases and loose, unconnected, slipshod allusions. It's not to take the first word that offers, but the best word in common use. It's not to throw words together in any combinations we please, but to follow and avail ourselves of the true idiom of the language. Anyone may mouth out a passage of theatrical cadence or get upon stilts to tell his thoughts, but to write or speak with propriety and simplicity is a more difficult task. And you can take out the word propriety, which sounds pretty distinctly 18th century, as elegance is also in Hazlitt. But the rest of it all sounds exactly like Dickens. If you look at his recommendation, if you look at his editorial work on submissions to his periodicals, these are exactly the things that time and again he says to people. There's a nice one, a gentle query written in response to a piece of Bulwer Lytton, where he asks him, a close friend, whether the modesties of art were not a little overpassed on him. And then saying, I myself never give way to my convention recklessly, but constantly restrain it. Now, in some ways, what I'm saying isn't necessarily new. A lot of people who've written about Dickens' style have written about a kind of tension between excess and restraint. There's a book with precisely that title, a very famous one from a few years back. But what they haven't argued, I think, is that there might be, as Dickens' career progresses and as the force of signature style Dickens becomes more copied, more imitated, more marketized, that move towards restraint might become more deliberate and more marked. That's where I'm going to push this a little bit. I'm going to take it through the late novel, the last novel, particularly, as I said, Edwin Drood. Now, before doing that, though, it's necessary to say something about what people conventionally think is going on with late style. The most common way of talking about how Dickens' style changes is to say that it darkens. That there is, especially around the mid-1950s, a kind of depression sets in, which is sometimes linked biographically to disappointment in his private life, to disappointment with some of his political or radical hopes, and that what you get is a kind of subduing of the tone of the novels. That's more often actually linked to their psychological, the way in which they explore psychology than it is to style proper. But the two are sometimes put together. On top of that, we have John Forster, his friend and first biographer, saying that there are signs in Dickens' working methods that his powers are beginning to fail and that he's beginning to worry and constrain himself. There's a feeling that the force, the power, the energy might run out. And he thinks that the fact that Dickens for the first time resorted to memoranda, making notes of where he wanted the novels to go, is probably a very strong sign of that happening. Now, you don't have to read it quite so anxiously, I think, as Forster, to reach a conclusion that something rather different is going on. And my own temptation, my own tendency is to think about the late novels rather as a kind of deliberate confrontation with the problem he'd made for himself by being so successful with one particular kind of style. Now, Edwin Drood, and I was saying in advance that I think I can take this up in a certain way, and then there's a point at which you can't push it too far because signature Dickens remains in that novel. He never lets it go, nor I think would he want to. But I think you can see as a kind of tense playing out his signature style where he's showing it to you, kind of framing it as Dickensian signature, and then raising some problems with it. It's a really, really odd novel to read, and not only because it's unfinished. How many of you saw the BBC version of it recently with the completion? But I don't know about you, I thought it was very good. I thought it was brilliant, actually, as a piece of coherent plotting. It's harder with film unless the filmmaker is particularly experimental in their methods to register just how strange what's going on the page is there stylistically. It's a real hodgepodge. It's very dislocated and dislocating. there are big generic and tonal shifts so that you'll be moved around between what looks like a mystery novel, a novel of religion, different kinds of comedy, melodrama, different kinds of realism. And most obviously maybe a kind of tension between signature Dickens, as I'm going to call it, and something which isn't signature Dickens. So let me give you the signature Dickens first. This is the piece at the top of your page, and the first example I've already given you of what normal Dickens looks like, so to speak, on the novels. Mr. Brutus's clerk, Bazzard, returned, accompanied by 2 waiters, an immovable waiter and a flying waiter. And the 3 brought in with them as much fog as gave a new roar to the fire. The flying waiter, who had brought everything on his shoulders, laid the cloth with amazing rapidity and dexterity, while the immovable waiter, who had brought nothing, found fault with him. The flying waiter then highly polished all the glasses he had brought, and the immovable waiter looked through them. The flying waiter then flew across Holborn for the soup and flew back again, and then took another flight for the made dish and flew back again, and then took another flight for the jointed poultry and flew back again, and between whiles took supplementary flights for a great variety of articles, as it was discovered from time to time that the immovable waiter had forgotten them all. But let the flying waiter cleave the air as he might, he was always reproached on his return by the immovable waiter for bringing fog with him and being out of breath. At the conclusion of the repast, by which time the flying waiter was severely blown, the immovable waiter gathered up the tablecloth under his arm with a grand air, and having sternly, not to say with indignation, looked on at the flying waiter while he set the clean glasses round, directed a valedictory glance towards Mr. Brutus, conveying, "Let it be clearly understood between us that the reward is mine and that nil is the claim of this slave," and pushed the flying waiter before him out of the room. Okay. It's got all the hallmarks of what Fitzgerald called brilliant buoyancy and colouring up for effect. So most obviously the comic oppositions, immovable, flying, fog, fire, everything, nothing. It's got that lovely mock heroic inflation in the middle, cleave the air, which goes straight into a pathetic descent into city slang. So the flying waiter wasn't severely blown. Severely blown doesn't come from the same place, as it were, from cleave the air. The grandiloquent attributed speech that the immovable waiter, they say, nil is the claim of the slave, is similarly being mocked, pathetically in what follows. And above all, you've got that stringing out of verbal repetition, making that central sentence contain so much that if you are reading it aloud, I have to take a breath from it all. So what you've got is a kind of a performance, a rhetoric, a performance of something that's already very familiarly known as Dickensian style. What makes it different? What makes it not just signature Dickens of the kind you would have seen in an earlier Dickens novel is this, it's what follows. He goes on to say, and I couldn't squeeze it onto the page, I'm sorry, it was like a highly finished miniature painting representing my lords of the Circumlocution Department, commandership-in-chief of any sort, government. It was quite an edifying little picture to be hung on the line in the National Gallery. Now that to me makes a huge difference, because what it says is, look at this, I'm framing it for you as a little scene of the kind that I have so famously given you so many times in the past. Have a look at it. I exhibit Dickensian style. Okay, that's one way in which it happens, and it happens repeatedly. But there are other ways in which Edwin Drood is continually holding up style and the repetition of a kind of a known set of stylistic effects to a sort of worry about what that means for the writer. Like most Dickens, Edwin Drood is full of Shakespeare. It's also full of the Book of Common Prayer, and most of them, for obvious reasons, the length of the cathedral. And it's full of popular song. Now, as I say, that's true of all of them, but what isn't true of all of them is a kind of brooding that goes on in all of it about whether that presence of an individual signature in the language is a good thing, as it clearly is in the case of Shakespeare, or whether it's a sign that something has grown stale and debased and no longer meaningful, which in Cloister and Cathedral is what is happening to the Book of Common Prayer. Just these stale echoes of the same service routine we've gone through. On to be giving this in church, this talk, but not inhabited with vigour or energy or any kind of making new of the terrain. One of the reasons that Dickens likes popular song, I think, is that it's unauthored. It's become detached from whoever first invented or wrote it and simply circulates because of its own affection or its own hold, often in children's language. Now, I'm going to spare you the kind of detailed bit where we go through Rosa Bud and Edwin Drood, but I think you can see in their relationship also that sense of the hold of the past being not necessarily legitimate, and the hold especially of old letters and vows, the vows and letters that were made between through their parents, having a kind of dubious right to keep on circulating and demanding their repetition in the present. I'm going to circle instead on something, on the question of what made this novel Dickens different from the others. I don't really know is the truth, but he left a few signs in his letters, and from what Forster reported him saying to him, it was clearly something about John Jasper's psychology, so the psychology of the villain, and I'm going to wreck it for you and tie my colours to the mast by saying that I sign up with all those other people who think that John Jasper is the murderer. I think it's quite difficult not to take that conclusion. The question is how and why he murders, and the BBC had one very clever explanation for why that might happen. And I should say that I think probably the best evidence we have for that is the letter he wrote to his illustrator saying that the scarf must be drawn longer because it is the murder weapon. Okay, so that's pretty much way out of the conclusion from that. But what was it that was new about John Jasper's psychology? Because if you think about most of the attributes, an older man being oppressively in love with a younger woman, he had done it before, many times before. Madeline and Mr. Grind. Arthur Plenner more sympathetically, and Neagles. So there's nothing new about that one. There's nothing new about a murderer. There's indeed nothing new about someone driven to homicidal impulses, Sykes onwards. The thing that seems to be new was the idea that one kind of criminal intellect might involve operating at a kind of distance on your own agency, so that you don't really know what the other part of you is doing, as if you're internally doubled or divided. And with John Jasper, that's clearly played out through the effects of opium, that there is a kind of opiate haze in which he does things, and that brings out an always latent criminal tendency. Now, even that he's done before. One of the hallmarks of certain kinds of comic character in Dickens is that they talk about themselves as if they were somewhere else. So Barkis is willing, or there's a pain somewhere in the room, but I couldn't possibly say I've got it. Or Cyrigan and Mrs. Harris. Mrs. Harris, leave the bottle on the chimney piece and don't ask me to take none of it, but let me put my lips to it when I'm so disposed. It wouldn't be me going to the alcohol bottle, it would be Mrs. Harris, who doesn't exist. Okay, but he seems in this case to have wanted to probe that kind of comic psychology as something much darker and with real and damaging effects. The thing that makes John Jasper, two things make John Jasper pathologically extreme in characterization. One of them is the inappropriate love for Rosabud, but the other one is the sense that he is an artist undergoing time and time again in the course of a single day a purely routinized performance. So he has this beautiful musical voice, and he goes to the cathedral every day. He performs wonderfully, bizarrely more wonderfully when he seems to be exhilarated by having committed murder. That's very worrying, with extra passion and zeal, better than he's ever done before in that moment. But all the other descriptions of him are of an artist who is suffering being on the treadmill of repetition. Now, I have to be careful though, because I'm obviously not saying that he's a representation of Dickens. Other people have said that, and have said that especially because of the passion for the young girl. What you've got here is Dickens in his later life, Alan Turner, playing out of that uncomfortable relationship. I don't think you have to go all the way down that line to say that there is a kind of fascination with art and the price of an art that becomes really routine. And if you really want to make the argument stick, and this is going to be the last bit of the talk, and then you can play me with questions, I think you probably would want to be able to see what's happening to Dickens' style in the process of writing. I don't know if any of the previous speakers have talked about Dickens' manuscripts, what it's like to read a Dickens manuscript. I would love to be able to show you, but one of the costs of the Dickens bicentennial is that the manuscripts have all been moved around to different exhibitions. Edwin Drood is under lock and key at the Museum of London, and if I wanted to go and take a photograph of it for you, a particular bit, I would have to get a V&A curator to travel across London with me, stand over me while I found it, photographed it, lock up everything again and go back. They're obviously not going to do this, so the piece of work that this belongs to will be published eventually. He's going to have to wait on the return of the manuscript in the middle of the bicentennial year. So I'm giving you the best I can get at it, which is a transcription of the passage where Jasper declares his love to Rosa in the garden of the school where she's living. And I've chosen it because it's a difficult case. Let me tell you a bit about the manuscript before I hone in what might be happening with revision, an eternal revision of style here. Dickens' manuscripts were always quite difficult to read, but late Dickens is beyond any order of difficulty that you find in the early one. The reason that we don't have what are called variorum editions of Dickens is that it is frankly impossible to do. Too much of it is simply illegible. So if you look at the very late pages of Edwin Drood, one of the suggestions is that his illness, cramping in the side, maybe to do with his kidneys, was actually causing him to lean over like that. I don't know. But the script goes down and down and down to the side, and it ends up being sort of triangulated into a corner at the bottom on some of the pages, some of them more exaggerated than others. There are so many crossings out, and they're not just crossings out, the kind that an editor is trained to work with through London time. He does something like old-fashioned telegraph wire over the top, so that you really can't read it. Circle, 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 the kind we might do in our own obsessive moments, perhaps in diaries or something like that. He's constantly squeezing things in above the line, below the line, rewriting. So you will see in the transcription I've given you this passage in a minute that a lot of it I find frankly illegible, as everybody who's tried before me has also to my relief. Okay, but the thing I think is odd is that this isn't more talked about as a problem with Dickens scholarship. Okay, the passage I'm going to look at is, I'm going to give it to you first from the Clarendon edition, so that's the improved scholarly edition, the Oxford University Press one. Rosa, says Jasper, even when my dear boy was affianced to you, I loved you madly. Even when I thought his happiness in having you for his wife was certain, I loved you madly. Even when I strove to make him more ardently devoted to you, I loved you madly. Even when he gave me the picture of your lovely face so carelessly traduced by him, which I feigned to hang always in my sight for his sake, but worshipped in torment for yours. They've written years. I loved you madly, in the distasteful work of the day, in the wakeful misery of the night, girded by sordid realities or wandering through paradises and hells of vision into which I rushed, carrying your image in my arms. I loved you madly. Well, the Saturday Review critic did not like this at all. In this precious oration, he rumbled, we recognise the worst style of Mr. Dickens, ticking off each point by the burden of I love you madly. But do we recognise anything like the language of a passionate and black-hearted villain trying to bully a timid girl? It's the sort of oration which a silly boy nourished on bad novels might prepare for such an occasion, but it is stiff and artificial and jerky to a degree which excludes any belief in real passion. It's rounded off prettily enough for a peroration in a debating society, or it might be a fair piece of acting for a romantic young tradesman who fancies himself doing his lovemaking in a high poetic style, but it has an air of affectation and mock heroics, which is palpably inappropriate to the place. It's really curious that so keen an observer should diverge into such poor and stilted bombast whenever he tries the mode of intense emotion. Well, you can kind of see how he got there, but it seems to me wrong. There is a complaint to be made against it as a passage, I think. But if it's bad style, it's not bad Dickensian style. It's something a little bit like it sometimes, but it isn't standard Dickensian style at all. It is stiff, it is artificial, it is jerky, but what it recalls to my ear much more strongly than Dickens is something like 18th century Richardson, the Restoration Rake, okay, rather than the kind of flamboyance or the kind of performative indirection that you get with Dickens much more standardly. Now, the most obvious aspect of restraint in the passage involves the player's style with and against the dramatic situation. So the first way in which it seems to me oddly restrained is if you think just about what's happening in that scene. He's forced her to to sit in the garden while he stands next to her by the sundial, and he won't let her move. So you have what's become a kind of classic horror movie scenario where the woman is forced to behave normally because eyes are commanding them from the windows above, when in fact she's been quite sinisterly threatened by somebody. So the surface appearance is still normal. And this very muted rhetoric, he's not shouting, he's speaking very gently, is working against it. So for a start, you get a certain kind of excess being played off against restraint to make it dramatically much more interesting. But the second one, and this is, I confess, much harder to get very far with, but we'll give it a go, is what happens if you look at the Victoria and Albert Museum Library original. This is the best I can do. No crossings out. Each of the ellipses in it represents something that is really illegible. And so one ellipsis is, as far as I can see, one word that can't be retained. I do not forget how many, sorry, just take it from Rosa. Rosa, time, that's probably supposed to be time was, when my dear boy was affianced to you, I loved you madly. The idea of his something happiness in deservings crossed out, having substituted. You for his wife was torture, crossed out, certain. I loved you still, crossed out, myself. Even when I strove something to make him something more ardently, something devoted to you, I loved you madly. Even when he gave me the picture of your lovely face sewn something carelessly produced by him, which I feigned, crossed out in the old spelling, feigned to accept for his sake but worshipped, all crossed out, which I hang always in my sight for his sight. And you can see what's happening, it's too awkward to read it all out. Now, it's not taking it down to anything like plain style, but it is involving a certain kind of reining in of a temptation to a certain kind of excess. The first and most obvious thing that he does is to naturalize some of the locutions. So commanding the garden is changed to commanding a view of us in the passage above. Desultory corners of the day becomes distasteful work of the day. Desired becomes loved. And then this one, when the style does find itself tugging towards, there's a very nice complaint by Dicken, by Gissing, that Dickens tends to fall into iambic pentameter when he's being passionate, and it's a kind of, sort of crude, borrowed poeticism. He does it only in the boredom, I love you. That's right. It's limited to boredom, that's right. But in such a way that it's framing or ironizing the staged excess. And once again, I loved you madly wasn't Dickens' first thought. That seems to me the most interesting thing. It wasn't the easy channel of repetition that you might expect. So the effect is not so much tonal instability in this instance as the kind of careful subduing of a direct threat. It still has to be excessive because it is a kind of restoration moment of confrontation. But there's a strong tendency to do something far more flamboyant that's being reined in small ways. Okay. It's for me a kind of slightly frustrating exercise to try, but I still think it's worth trying. The manuscripts are, as I say, so difficult to read that you can do much less than you could with any other writer. But you can see there, I think, again, the psychological condition of the man driven mad, not just by love for a younger woman, by the repetition of an art that's become stale to him, and by the circumstance of framing Dickensian style when it arises, asking me to look at it as if it's framed, and then finally by these small suggestions that in the process of writing, he is trying a kind of reining in and a different kind of exaggerated style borrowed from the 18th century rather than his own exaggerations. When you put all that together, and we don't know where it would have gone from there, it seems to me that you can see something in late Dickens which is not completely reacting against the success of Dickensian style, trying to make it do something else, and above all trying to make you think about it as something that bears a cost. Okay, I will stop there. You can ask me questions. Thank you.
Have you seen any of the manuscripts of the earlier novels? And if you have, are there as many crossings out and as many difficult things to read as there are really in the group?
It's difficult because some of them are rewritten there and some of them are redone at fairhand, and he runs out of that kind of time. The schedule is so packed in those last 2 years, especially because of public readings and the demands of clerical work and a complicated home life to go mildly, that you can see him not running through that. He's also by then got a set of compositors at the printing press who know his hands so well, and Forster, who seems to be his intermediary with them, that he has a kind of system that's working for him, so he can afford to send something in that's in much less tidy shape. We don't really know quite what happened with these very last ones, whether Dickens himself intended to be there in printing house, standing over them and making sure it was right, or whether that just wasn't possible, those records aren't quite there. So the only ones that is still quite a bit of crossing out and rethinking. The Old Curiosity Shop is the one I work with most often, where he has to take quite a lot out at the last stage, where he realizes he's occupied too many pages for the periodical number, but nothing like this kind of wrestling at the level of the phrase by phrase by phrase.
Comment.
Could you say something a little bit more about the understanding of the psychology at that time and how it affected their understanding of his style?
Do you mean understanding of psychology generally, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, he's a difficult case. If you want to work on, there are certain writers that you can choose to work on if you, like me, like several people in the faculty here, are interested in Victorian psychology literature. And they're great to work on because, you know, they've read the theory and the medicine and were brooding on it. So George Eliot is a fantastic choice. Charlotte Bronte is a pretty good one. We know both of them read contemporary medical writers and physiologists and so forth and thought hard about the available theories. Dickens was very interested in institutions for the insane, so he was interested in the social management of problems of mind, but he doesn't seem to be interested in the theory at all. So for me, that makes something like literary models of mind, you know, borrowing the notion of the restoration rate, or thinking about doubling in a way that someone like James Hall, you know, earlier writers, romantic writers especially, have done better channels to take him through. But you end up with, you know, very loose speculation about what might have been in the air if you go the other route with him. So he's very, very interested in theories that were really widely dispersed and are not particularly medical or psychological or scientific, and that's theories that there is a cost to the suppression of being evil, that it will somehow, you know, spill out or burst to the bubble, that kind of thing. That it's like a, you know, a pressure valve that's waiting to blow. Sykes, Jasper. And also, sorry, I should say behind that, what fits nicely with that is that I think everybody writing about him in his last years and after he dies subscribes, all good Victorians did, to the theory that you have a limited life force, and if you burn it up too quickly, you die young. So, that's very good.
He starts in the history. What do you specifically refer to? Character, language, or plot, or structure?
We're not talking about style.
Yeah, it starts in the history. So what do you specifically refer?
I'm not talking about plot or character. I'm talking about the distinctive uses of the language at the level of grammar, syntax, repetitions, patterns of linguistic style. No, I'm not treating it as a linguist proper would do. I'm treating it as a literary stylistics person would do. Okay.
Yes, you mentioned the sort of possible genealogy of style.
Yeah.
Do we know what Dickens did read?
We know some of it. Some of what we know is slightly Dickens. It's used to mock him. That, you know, the old line that he wasn't properly educated because of years taken out in the back in warehouse. There's a lovely bit where George Eliot's partner, George Henry Lewis, goes to visit him when he's newly very successful and looks at the library and suddenly realises that it's full of bought glossy sets of volumes, fake backs of books, and it's actually just kind of a display, vulgar thing rather than a real library. That's very unfair because when he died, his library was sold at auction, and that gives us the best record we had. Now, what you hold in your library isn't necessarily the same thing as what you've read. We all know we've got books on our shelves that we have yet to read, or we certainly to read cover to cover. So, again, you're slightly in the world of speculation. We don't have, we have very few copies of his own books where there would be helpful annotations that would give us some record of his reading practice. He's a no-go zone for that kind of criticism. But we know quite a lot about certainly his early reading, which is all there in the autobiographical fragment, and then his letters and journal, and not journals, his letters and some of his periodical pieces are quite good parts to that. So he's not a reader of, you know, philosophy or big theoretical, the heavy stuff, but he's very interested in anything to do with comedy, to do with theatre, to do with prisons, to do with sociology in a broad sense.
I was just wondering if you'd like to say anything more about how his private life impinged on his style earlier in the adulthood.
Was it earlier?
Yes.
You mean the bit when I was talking about darkening? Yeah, just when people talk about that, in the main, as I said, they're talking about psychology, the other ways in which you might interpret style, that the man in the back was suggesting to me. So, I don't think anybody has traced really dramatic differences at the level of grammar and syntax and so forth going on. what changes is the kind of metaphor that's used. So metaphors of shadow and shade and darkness become very prominent. It's much more direct, whereas they have been so prominent in early ones with something more teasingly performative or more dramatic might be going on in metaphor or similar. But I don't know that anyone's ever talked about a kind of deliberate effort to change one's style in late Dickens. Which seems to have some credibility. Okay.
And one of the things I most dislike about Dickens is his
Always good stuff.
sentimentality. And I wonder, sentimentality. I wonder whether he ever was sort of whether there was any indication that he was aware of that, and whether he had an approach to that he's deliberately wanting to draw people in a fairly crude, emotional way, and whether, as you've described him becoming more restrained as he got older, whether there was any sense of conscious restraint about that. It's interesting in Edwin Drood that you still get the silly name Rosa Bud, but she does at least stand up and say, I don't want to marry you after all, which is quite unusual.
Well, on women, we have one fantastic piece in a letter to John Forster, which Clint Tomlin's biography of the relationship with Ellen Taylor picks out, where he says, John Forster has clearly said to him something like, you know, all these really interesting women in your real life who are involved in philanthropy, who have careers, who are intelligent, George Eliot, you know, why don't you ever represent a less sentimental or silly version of a woman in your writing? And he says, I blame your morality. I haven't got his words exactly right, but your morality is right. He said, the kind of audience I'm writing for, of which you are a good representative, just don't want it. What they want is this highly marketable sentimentalization. He is, however, very critical of writers who send him things to the periodicals that are just mushy sentiment. So when he does it, most famously in something like The Death of Little Nell, it's always framed, it's always set against something which isn't sentiment, which is the comedy of the Marchioness and Dick Swiveller in that story, retelling exactly the same story but making it not end in death, making it end in comic, coming back to life. So it's only in the prison stories, which are of course a very tight vehicle in their own right, do you tend to see sentimentalism just given full sway. But even then it's set against a kind of reality that is grimly bad and needs correction. What gets lost when people don't like sentimentalism now, except if you think about it in some kinds of American film, is that sentimentalism has a quite radical trajectory. It's a mode that has always belonged to the lower classes as a kind of a way of staging emotions in big form, as sort of big oppositions of good and bad, and it can be made to do quite strong moral work. So sometimes I think historically we need to take a step back and think, yes, it doesn't last. It's got a very short shelf life, but in its time, extremely powerful.
I think that might be it. Thank you. This is what we're feminist talk. That is really interesting.